For many of us on the spiritual path, freedom from suffering is our highest aspiration. We want to find liberation, we want to find enlightenment. But if we are not careful, we can get too caught up in avoiding suffering at all costs. And when we are caught in this mode of being, with this identity, this kind of spiritual ego, that is what creates more suffering. So it is our avoidance of suffering that creates the suffering. But in order to honor our incarnation in this life, we have to realize that suffering is the point. Sorry. There's somebody mowing grass in the background. So this is causing me a lot of suffering right now. Not really. I think it's funny that the moment before I started recording, it was absolutely silent. And the moment I started recording, then the whole world seems to have woken up at the same time. Nobody's fault. That's just God manifesting in the form of a weed whacker in order to see how spiritual I really am. I will not fail the test. I promise. But I am pissed. I'm just gonna have to bear through this. I'm not attached. I am the non-attached awareness behind all things. No experiences can bother me. Okay. Stressful. Okay, this is a serious topic. It is precisely when we are suffering in which we realize the true definition of being grateful. Because the harsh fact is that it is difficult to appreciate what we have in abundance. So if there was just all life and no death, then it would just be business as usual. We could be floating around in heaven forever, for all eternity, but without the possibility of hell, what would it mean? There would be no thing to compare it to. There would be no contrast. And we all know this. We've all heard it 1,000 times before. You can't appreciate the light unless you know the darkness. You can't appreciate the warmth unless you know what it means to be cold. You can't appreciate food unless you know what it means to be hungry. So too, we cannot appreciate happiness and peace and joy and love if we do not also know suffering. And so we have to be careful not to get too caught up in trying to be completely free from all suffering. Because suffering, in a way, is the spice of life. Without suffering, there is no excitement. And I don't mean that in a happy way. I mean that in a literal way in which suffering causes us to act or to move. It excites our being. In a way, it shocks us. Now, of course, we don't want to be suffering all the time, in unbearable suffering. And in that regard, we'll think about it this way. Most people will never reach a state of enlightenment or liberation or nirvana or heaven precisely because they do not suffer enough. The worst, absolute worst thing that you can do is to live a life that is not really that good, but it's not really that bad either. That is why Christ said in Revelations, if you are neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out. Because being lukewarm is bland. If you live a lukewarm life, where's the story? Where's the meaning? Where's the adventure? You don't truly live without experiencing some extremes. You don't know what it's like to live unless you've been on the edge of death, unless you know that suffering. And so it is often those who suffer the most who have the greatest opportunity for awakening. So I encourage you not to view your suffering so much as a terrible, terrible thing. Even though it is, and it can be, the trick is to take a step back, coming from that place of a non-attached awareness, that witness, to see the utility in the suffering. Rather than to get so caught up in our animal nature in which we are so heavily trying to avoid pain, we use it to live our lives to the best of our ability. Because in truth, as it's been said many times, the dark and the light are equally important to the wholeness of all things. And a lot of our beliefs discourage any idea that the dark is good. In fact, any religion or any belief that operates from ego consciousness will specifically demonize the darkness. And it's not that they're wrong necessarily. Of course, you don't want evil people doing evil things. But the truth remains nonetheless that evil people play a role in this life, and that is the way it was designed. And a lot of us won't be able to accept that. Evil is just a byproduct that is necessary to sustain balance. And we would prefer all evil be eliminated, but we do not understand the nature of things and why that can never be so. At least not from this level of ego consciousness. And even if we were to rid the evil on this planet, you still have the billions, if not trillions, of other planets in the universe that have not rid themselves of evil. So we mistakenly assume that somehow there can ever be an imbalance between the dark and the light. The universe is inherently balanced and will always return to equilibrium. That does not mean that we do not strive to rise against evil, but getting rid of evil was never the point. Evil exists in the world because they give meaning to what is good. Because if there was no evil force, then there would be no good either. If there was no villain, there would be no hero. And so the point was never to get rid of evil, but to rise up in spite of it. Because that, by definition, is heroic. To stand up for what is right and what is good in the face of death. So how might we deal with suffering? Ask yourself, who is that who suffers? Because what you will find is that suffering is a consequence of the mind. It's a consequence of the story that we tell ourselves. It's a consequence of the identity of who we believe we are. Because what you can experience is that you are the witness of that who suffers. But you are not the sufferer. And we have the power to detach ourselves and remain as a non-attached awareness in which suffering arises and suffering falls away. But when we have identification with the mind, with a personality, then it becomes personal. When suffering arises, we say, I am suffering. When we are in pain, we say, I am in pain. But that awareness that you are cannot suffer. It cannot experience pain because it transcends the entire physical universe. That unchanging consciousness that is awareness is eternal, and therefore it is not touched by the temporary. It is unchanging and therefore is not touched by the changing. But we cannot access this kind of safe space unless we come to this realization of our true nature. Because suffering arises when we identify with the changing. Because the nature of change is death. Things arise, things fall away. And so when we identify with things that arise and fall away, when we're in the arising stage, we anticipate the future, which is death, in which we will go away. But when you take a step back and realize that everything is arising and falling within the unchanging awareness that you are, then fear no longer is a factor for you. When you realize that you are the eternal unchanging awareness, what is death? Death is but another moment, and you have experienced a lifetime of moments. Death is just the changing of the scene in which you have already experienced an infinite array of changing scenes upon the backdrop of the unchanging awareness. This is how we can become safe from suffering and have the distance and non-attachment to see the utility in it, because we are no longer identified with that which suffers. But so long as we are identified with the changing, the temporary, then we are in the midst of suffering and unable to live life fully. It's the difference between being underneath a great storm and being in an airplane looking down below at it. From one perspective, there's a problem, and from another perspective, there is no problem, because the storm does not touch you. But it all comes down to where you place your identity. Because if you place your identity on this body, then anything that happens to the body, you will experience it happening to you. When you identify with the mind, anything that affects you psychologically, you will experience it happening to you. It's not that it's not happening. It's that our identity is misplaced, and therefore we become one with the suffering. But we can become free from suffering by removing our identification with that which suffers. You have this power, and all humans do, but very few have ever come to this realization. There was once a story of a monk who was walking by and saw one of his brothers banging his head against a wall. And the monk said, "Why are you doing this?" And the man banging his head against the wall said, "It feels good when I stop." That, in a way, is the essence of the utility of suffering. Because when we suffer and we no longer experience suffering, that contrast creates a greater amount of happiness, a greater amount of joy. Whereas if we were happy and joyful from the very beginning of our life, then we would not know anything else. And if we did not know anything else and then suffered, the suffering would be far worse, because we would experience the absence of joy, of peace, of happiness, of love. And so to the degree in which we experience that contrast is how extreme the emotions are, or the experiences are. So to have extreme happiness, we might have to go through extreme unhappiness. Sometimes the way to heaven is through hell. And so if we can take a step back and realize the utility of suffering, then we will not suffer so much trying to escape it, but rather we can use it for its intended purpose, to create the contrast in which we can experience extreme joy, love, peace. The goal is not to suffer. The goal is to suffer and rise above it. The goal is not to get rid of fear, but to act in spite of it. The goal is not to eliminate evil. The goal is to stand up against it. Because that is what it means to be a hero. And you cannot have a hero without the villain.